Chapter 1: A Telegram Across the Atlantic. The gas lamp outside 221B Baker Street cast a pallid glow through the perpetual London fog, its light struggling to penetrate the thick, damp shroud that clung to the city like a somber garment. Within our modest quarters, the fire in the grate crackled cheerfully, offering a welcome antidote to the chill that invariably seeped into one's very bones during an English autumn. I, John Watson, found myself comfortably ensconced in my armchair, the latest edition of the Lancet resting upon my lap, though my attention was drawn more to the companion opposite me. Sherlock Holmes, perched on the edge of his own chair, was engaged in one of his periods of profound mental activity. A cloud of acrid smoke from his foulest shag tobacco coiled about his head, and his long, lean fingers hammered an impatient tattoo upon the armrest. He had spent the better part of the afternoon poring over a faded map of the Balkan states, muttering occasionally about forgotten treaties and the peculiar habits of obscure monastic orders. This was a familiar prelude to a new case, or perhaps merely an intellectual exercise to stave off the dreaded stagnation he so abhorred. A sharp rap on the door, followed by Mrs. Hudson's brisk entry, broke the tranquil silence. She bore a silver tray upon which rested a telegram, its yellow envelope stark against the polished metal. "For you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, her tone betraying a hint of the usual curiosity that attended such urgent dispatches. Holmes's eyes, hitherto distant and preoccupied, snapped into focus. He took the telegram, tearing it open with a characteristic impatience that belied his otherwise controlled demeanor. I watched him, as always, for the subtle shifts in his countenance that often spoke volumes before he uttered a single word. His brow, initially furrowed in anticipation, smoothed into a more pensive expression. His lips, usually thin and firm, pursed slightly. "From New York, Watson," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, yet with an undertone that caught my ear. I set my journal aside. "New York, Holmes?" A curious direction for a case. He handed me the flimsy paper. The message was terse, almost brutally so, suggesting either extreme haste or a deliberate economy of words. Holmes. Finch gravely ill. Untraceable malady. Physicians baffled. Need your discernment. Urgent. Finch, Alistair. My medical training immediately registered the gravity. Professor Alistair Finch. I exclaimed. The eminent botanist from Columbia? I recall his name from our university days, Holmes. A brilliant man, if a trifle reclusive. What could this untraceable malady be? My mind began to race through the catalogues of rare diseases and obscure tropical fevers that might afflict one engaged in the study of exotic flora. Holmes took back the telegram, his gaze fixed on the sparse text. "Observe, Watson," he began, tapping a long finger on the paper. No mention of specific symptoms, merely of gravely ill and untraceable malady. A physician, even a distraught one, would offer a modicum of clinical detail. Yet, physicians baffled is stated with absolute certainty. And I need your discernment, not your advice or your medical opinion. This is a plea, Watson, for more than mere diagnosis. He stood and walked to the window, peering out into the swirling fog. Finch is a man of precise intellect. For him to send such an elliptical message across the Atlantic suggests a situation far more dire and far less straightforward than a mere illness. He is not merely sick, he is under some inexplicable duress, and he fears the very nature of his affliction. "But, Holmes," I interjected, a wave of concern washing over me. "To cross the ocean for an old acquaintance's sickness? Even if it is perplexing, surely the greatest medical minds of New York can solve it." Holmes turned from the window, a glint entering his eyes that I knew well, the spark of intellectual challenge, the scent of an intricate puzzle. "Ah, Watson, you assume it is merely a medical puzzle. I, on the other hand, suspect it is a problem of human agency, disguised as a natural ailment. Finch, I believe, is trying to tell me, with the utmost discretion, that he is not simply unwell, but that something is being done to him." He puffed thoughtfully on his pipe. The absence of specific medical terms, the almost desperate urgency cloaked in academic reserve, the direct appeal to my discernment, all these point to a deliberate obfuscation, a mystery. And when a mystery presents itself, Watson, no distance is too great, no inconvenience too burdensome. He strode to the mantelpiece, tapping his pipe against it. "Prepare your bags, my dear fellow. It seems New York calls. And I have a distinct premonition that this untraceable malady will prove to be far more fascinating, and indeed, far more sinister, than a simple illness of the body." I sighed, yet a thrill of excitement, familiar to all who accompanied Holmes on his adventures, began to course through me. My medical bags, seldom left unpacked for long, would soon see service across the vast Atlantic. The fog-laden streets of London would give way to the bustling avenues of New York, and a new, potentially dangerous, chapter was about to begin. Chapter 2: The City of Giants and a Fading Friend. The vast expanse of the Atlantic, though tamed by the regular passage of steamships, nonetheless imposed its own solemn rhythm upon our days. The long voyage across the turbulent waters offered Holmes ample opportunity for silent contemplation, punctuated by the occasional scientific treatise or a particularly knotty analytical problem. For my part, I spent the time preparing for the medical challenge ahead, reviewing textbooks on toxicology and obscure diseases, though with a growing sense of unease. Holmes's earlier pronouncement, that Finch's malady stemmed from human agency, had planted a seed of suspicion in my mind that no medical volume could fully address. Upon our arrival in New York, we were met by a scene of bewildering clamor and relentless energy. The towering edifices of Manhattan, thrusting upwards with audacious ambition, seemed to mock the venerable, low-slung grandeur of London. The incessant roar of horse-drawn traffic, the cacophony of 1,000 foreign tongues, and the sheer press of humanity created an impression both exhilarating and overwhelming. Holmes, however, navigated this urban labyrinth with characteristic detachment, his keen eyes absorbing every detail, his mind already filtering the pertinent from the superfluous. Our destination was an elegant brownstone nestled amidst the academic quietude bordering Columbia University, a stark contrast to the city's boisterous commercial heart. Professor Finch's residence, though well-maintained, carried an air of subdued melancholy. We were admitted by a woman of middle age, her face etched with concern, who introduced herself as Mrs. Hudson, no relation to our own, though the name brought a momentary, comforting flicker of familiarity. She led us with hushed urgency up a grand, carpeted staircase to the professor's bedchamber. The room, though spacious and filled with light, was dominated by the pale, emaciated figure lying in the large four-poster bed. Professor Alastair Finch, whom I remembered as a man of robust frame and vibrant intellectual vigor, was now a shadow of his former self. His face, once animated by a scholar's passion, was now sunken and pallid, his eyes dull and unfocused. "Alastair," Holmes murmured, a rare touch of genuine concern entering his voice as he approached the bedside. Finch stirred weakly, a faint recognition flickering in his eyes, but he could offer little more than a whisper. I immediately began my examination. The symptoms Mrs. Hudson recounted: chronic fatigue, profound muscle weakness that sometimes left him unable to lift his head, intermittent tremors that ran through his limbs, and a distressing respiratory distress that made each breath a visible effort, were indeed bewildering. His mental faculties, once so sharp, were now dulled, clouded by a pervasive lethargy that seemed to drug his very spirit. The local physicians, Mrs. Hudson explained, her voice cracking with emotion, they have tried everything. They speak of exotic pathogens, of profound stress, even suggest it is a malady of the mind. But he has wasted away before our eyes, Dr. Watson. I noted the baffling inconsistency with known diseases. While some symptoms suggested a neurological complaint, others pointed to systemic poisoning, and yet others defied easy categorization. There was no fever, no distinct rash, no telltale signs of a specific bacterial or viral infection. The standard tests, I surmised, would indeed yield nothing conclusive, leaving the medical fraternity grasping at straws. Holmes, meanwhile, conducted his own, more subtle, examination. While I pressed my stethoscope to Finch's chest and felt his thready pulse, Holmes's gaze swept across the room. He observed the partially eaten tray of food on the bedside table, the array of bottled medicines, the books scattered about the room, the pattern of dust motes dancing in the sunlight filtering through the window. He absorbed the details of Finch's study visible through an open door, a room filled with botanical specimens and scientific instruments. He knelt by the professor's bedside, not to take his pulse, but to observe the faint, almost imperceptible discoloration of the skin on the back of his hands, a subtle mottling that might easily be overlooked. He sniffed the air, a peculiar habit of his when a new environment presented itself. I saw a minute flicker of recognition in his eyes, almost imperceptible. "Watson," Holmes said, finally rising to his feet, his voice quiet but firm, "the local physicians are, I fear, looking in the wrong direction entirely. This is not the work of nature, nor is it a product of the mind. The pattern of decline, the specific constellation of symptoms, and indeed, a faint, almost imperceptible odor that lingers here, a dry, botanical scent, alien to this room, all suggest a methodical, external cause. Finch is not suffering from an illness, my dear fellow, but from a persistent and insidious attack." The cold light of certainty now shone in his grey eyes, replacing any earlier hint of concern. "The game, as they say in this new world, is afoot." Chapter 3: Threads of Routine and Disruption. With Professor Finch resting fitfully under the watchful eye of Mrs. Hudson, Holmes wasted no time in commencing his peculiar investigations. His methods, ever the antithesis of the conventional, began not with the grand or the obvious, but with the minutiae of daily life. "My dear Mrs. Hudson," Holmes began, addressing the housekeeper in the sitting-room, "I must implore your patience and your powers of recollection. No detail, however trifling it may seem to you, is beneath our consideration in this matter." Mrs. Hudson, a stout woman with a kindly but worried countenance, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I shall do my best, Mr. Holmes. It breaks my heart to see the professor this way. Such a good, quiet man, never a bother to anyone." "Precisely," Holmes interjected. "A creature of habit, I presume." "Oh, most certainly. Like clockwork, he was. Up at 6, breakfast at 7, then to his study until noon. A light lunch, then back to his books or specimens until tea. An evening walk, sometimes, before a quiet dinner and an hour or two with his journals before bed." "And has this routine been disturbed recently, beyond the unfortunate onset of his illness?" Mrs. Hudson pondered for a moment. "Not that I can think of, sir. He's always been rather a solitary sort. Few visitors, mostly academic colleagues. And since he's been unwell, of course, no one save the doctors." "No unusual deliveries? No strange packages? Any new servants, or tradesmen perhaps, who have had cause to enter the apartment regularly?" "None, sir. The same milkman, the same grocer's boy, for years. And I've been with the professor since he moved here 5 years ago. No, nothing out of the ordinary at all, save for his fading health." Holmes nodded, accepting her testimony without comment, yet his eyes betrayed a subtle dissatisfaction. He preferred the exceptional, the anomaly that shattered the mundane. If all was ordinary, then the extraordinary malady was all the more perplexing. He then embarked upon a systematic perambulation of the apartment. I followed him, notebook in hand, observing his every move. He examined the kitchen first, scrutinizing the pantry, the cooking utensils, the sources of food and water. He tested the gas taps, observed the state of the ventilation, and even peered into the waste bin. Finding nothing of note, he moved to the professor's study. This was a room that spoke volumes of its occupant. Bookshelves groaned under the weight of countless volumes on botany, natural history, and obscure sciences. Desiccated plant specimens lay pressed between sheets of paper, and a powerful microscope stood ready on a large oak desk, surrounded by meticulously labeled jars of powders and tinctures. Holmes ran a gloved finger along the desk, along the spines of books, carefully sniffing at the dust motes he collected. He paid particular attention to any item Finch would have handled frequently: his favorite armchair, the telephone receiver, the pens on his desk. He even examined the doorknobs for any unusual film or residue. What struck me was the almost clinical tidiness of the entire establishment. Every book was aligned, every specimen categorized, every surface dusted. It was the apartment of a man who lived a life of absolute order, a stark and chilling contrast to the biological chaos now consuming his body. "Remarkable order, Watson," Holmes murmured, a faint frown creasing his brow. "One might almost call it obsessive. Such a mind would undoubtedly register even the slightest deviation from its carefully constructed universe." We returned to the main hallway, passing by the closed door of Finch's bedroom. It was then that Holmes paused, his head cocked slightly, like a hound scenting a distant quarry. He knelt slowly, his magnifying glass appearing as if by magic from his waistcoat pocket. He began to examine the lower edge of Finch's bedroom door, where it met the polished hardwood floor. "Tell me, Watson," he said, his voice low, "do you perceive a scent here, stronger than what we noted in the bedroom, yet equally elusive?" I leaned closer, inhaling deeply. Indeed, a faint, dry, almost herbaceous aroma, not unpleasant but undeniably distinct, was perceptible. It was subtle, easily dismissed as a residual scent from some botanical experiment, but here, in the hallway, it seemed more concentrated, less diffused. Holmes continued his examination, his eye running along the narrow gap beneath the door. "And observe, Watson, this faint striation along the bottom of the door frame. Almost invisible to the naked eye, a minute discoloration, as if a very fine powder had repeatedly settled here and been wiped away, or perhaps built up over time." He then turned his attention to the floorboards directly beneath the door. And here, a faint, almost imperceptible scratch, no more than a hair's breadth wide, running parallel to the door's arc. Not the mark of a heavy foot or a piece of furniture, but something light, perhaps metallic, that has repeatedly scraped the surface. He stood, dusting his knees with an absent gesture. The professor, you say, was a creature of habit, never deviated from his routine. So Mrs. Hudson stated, Holmes. Then his illness, which emerged with such baffling consistency, must have a source equally consistent, equally methodical. And if it is not in his food, his water, his books, or his study, then it must be in the one place he cannot avoid, the place that marks the boundary between his ordered world and the outside. Holmes gestured pointedly at the bottom of the bedroom door. The agent, my dear Watson, whatever its nature, has been introduced through this very aperture. Someone, with deliberate and malicious intent, has been regularly delivering a toxic substance into Professor Finch's private sanctuary. The flicker in his eyes was no longer of mere curiosity, but of cold, calculating certainty. The door to his chamber, it appears, has been the door to his undoing. Chapter 4: The Unseen Agent. The revelation at Professor Finch's bedroom door cast a grim new light upon the entire affair. Holmes, with his characteristic economy of motion, rose from his kneeling position, his eyes alight with a cold, intellectual fire. He paced the length of the hallway, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind visibly racing. The evidence, Watson, points unequivocally away from the accepted theories of contagion or natural degeneration, he declared, stopping abruptly to fix me with his gaze. Consider the symptoms: a creeping paralysis of the will and body, intermittent tremors, respiratory distress, and an overwhelming lethargy. These are not the explosive manifestations of an acute poisoning, nor the clear-cut degeneration of a common disease. They are, rather, the hallmarks of a slow, insidious depletion, a gradual unraveling of the bodily functions. Indeed, Holmes, I concurred, reviewing my notes. There is no fever, no inflammation typical of infection. No sudden onset, but a prolonged decline. The local physicians were understandably baffled, for they sought a single, definitive cause, whilst this, I suspect, is a calculated accumulation. Precisely, Watson. And now, let us dismiss the more obvious avenues of attack. Finch, as Mrs. Hudson attested, was a man of meticulous habits. His food and drink were prepared with care, often by his own hand or by Mrs. Hudson. To introduce a poison orally, consistently enough to produce such an effect, without detection by taste or smell, would require a level of daring and ingenuity that scarcely seems necessary when simpler methods exist. Furthermore, to administer it directly, through personal contact, would invite scrutiny and risk exposure, particularly to a man of Finch's reclusive nature. Holmes gestured towards the bedroom door. No, the solution lies here. The faint, herbal odor, barely perceptible to the untrained nose, and the minute discoloration at the threshold, suggest a substance that is either airborne or transdermal in its action. A fine powder, perhaps, or a volatile vapor, released in small, undetectable quantities, day after day, until its cumulative effect became apparent. But how, Holmes? I pressed, fascinated by his deductions. How could such a substance be introduced with such consistency yet remain unseen? And why under the door? Ah, the how is the very essence of the crime, Watson. Imagine a fine dust, perhaps blown through a narrow tube, or a volatile essence sprayed from a discreet atomizer. The very act of pushing it under the door, a movement subtle enough to escape notice, particularly if performed during periods when the apartment was otherwise quiet, would deposit the agent directly into Finch's immediate environment. The tiny scratch on the floorboards, for instance, hints at the regular passage of some small implement, consistently applied. My medical mind began to grapple with this new hypothesis. If it is an airborne or transdermal agent, then the symptoms make a chilling sort of sense. Many plant alkaloids, for instance, possess potent neurotoxic properties. Certain fungal toxins can also produce a creeping paralysis, affecting muscle function and respiratory control, often with a delayed onset. Given Finch's profession as a botanist, his attacker would know that he might be exposed to plant compounds, perhaps even dismiss early symptoms as an occupational hazard or a new allergy. Excellent, Watson, Holmes remarked, a rare smile gracing his lips. You follow my line of reasoning admirably. The choice of toxin, I venture to say, would be one that mimics a natural illness, or indeed, exacerbates a perceived weakness in a botanist. A biological agent, difficult to trace, slow-acting, and requiring a particular expertise to synthesize or even identify. Our antagonist, it would seem, possesses not only a malicious intent but also a profound understanding of natural science. He paused, gazing thoughtfully at the door. This eliminates the random hooligan, the common thief, or even the impassioned amateur. We are dealing with a mind of some cultivation, Watson, one that seeks not merely to destroy, but to dismantle with precision. A mind that has weaponized knowledge. So, the person responsible, I mused, would likely be someone with access to such compounds, and a deep knowledge of their physiological effects. Indeed, my dear fellow, Holmes affirmed. And such an individual, given the methodical nature of the attack, would likely reside in close proximity, allowing for the consistent, furtive delivery of the poison. We must now turn our attention to the immediate neighborhood, to those who possess both the means and a motive to orchestrate such a slow, cruel demise. The bustling city outside seemed to fade, replaced by the chilling clarity of a crime meticulously conceived and executed. The mystery, far from being medical, was now unequivocally human, and the hunt for the unseen agent had begun in earnest. Chapter 5 of The Scholar's Envy. With the precise methodology of the attack now firmly established in Holmes's mind, our focus shifted from the afflicted to the potential afflictor. The vastness of New York City, which had initially seemed a daunting canvas for investigation, now narrowed considerably to the confines of Professor Finch's immediate dwelling. The perpetrator, Holmes reasoned, must be someone with consistent access, yet enough detachment to avoid direct suspicion, a neighbor, perhaps, who could operate under the cloak of anonymity afforded by a large apartment building. Our initial inquiries began with the amiable but somewhat flustered building manager, a Mr. O'Malley, whose knowledge of his tenants was, as Holmes dryly observed, more expansive than profound. Through a series of seemingly innocuous questions about the building's maintenance, its residents' habits, and any recent disputes, Holmes began to sketch a rudimentary map of the inhabitants. Anyone nearby with a particular predilection for late-night activity, Mr. O'Malley? Holmes inquired, as we stood in the dimly lit hallway outside Finch's apartment. Perhaps a scholar, one who keeps unusual hours. O'Malley scratched his head. Well, there's young Mr. Blackwood, sir. Lives right next door to Professor Finch, apartment for B. A quiet sort, mostly. Always seems to be working, even late into the night. Students, you know, always burning the midnight oil. A student, you say? What is his field of study? Biology, I think, O'Malley offered, at Columbia, same as the professor. Keeps himself to himself, Mr. Blackwood does. Never causes any trouble, but he's not one for small talk. Bit of a genius, some say, though he never smiles, if you take my meaning. Holmes's eyes glinted. Indeed, Mr. O'Malley, I believe I do. The name Blackwood seemed to resonate with a latent memory in Holmes's prodigious mind. A swift consultation of Finch's academic journals, found in the professor's study, confirmed his suspicion. Silas Blackwood, a brilliant but undeniably volatile postgraduate student, had indeed been a frequent contributor to scientific periodicals, often publishing critiques, some bordering on outright diatribes, of Professor Finch's more conventional botanical theories. There had been a public, if minor, intellectual skirmish several years prior at a university symposium, where Blackwood had vehemently challenged Finch's findings on plant molecular structures, only to be politely, yet firmly, refuted by the elder professor. It was a skirmish that Finch had likely forgotten, but one that Holmes correctly surmised a man of Blackwood's temperament would not. "Ah, Watson," Holmes murmured, a note of satisfaction in his voice as he closed a journal article on the controversial Finch-Blackwood conjecture. The intellectual affront, however minor, can often fester into a wound far deeper than any physical injury. Particularly for a mind that perceives itself as superior, yet perpetually overshadowed. We began a discreet surveillance of Mr. Blackwood's apartment. Holmes, with his talent for blending into any background, positioned us at a vantage point where we could observe Blackwood's comings and goings without arousing suspicion. It was a cold, patient vigil, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the city. Blackwood proved to be as reclusive as O'Malley had described. He emerged sparingly, usually in the late evening or early morning, carrying a worn leather satchel. He was a slight figure, hunched over, with a pallid complexion and spectacles perched precariously on his nose. His eyes, though intelligent, held a restless, almost resentful gleam. What caught Holmes's immediate attention was not merely Blackwood's nocturnal habits, but a subtle olfactory clue. As Blackwood occasionally opened his door to retrieve his newspaper or dispose of refuse, a peculiar scent would waft from his apartment. It was a faint, slightly acrid, organic smell, reminiscent of certain chemical reactions or botanical distillations. It was, Holmes noted, not entirely dissimilar to the faint herbaceous odor we had detected lingering near Professor Finch's door. Furthermore, at odd hours, a low, rhythmic hum, almost imperceptible, could be heard emanating from Blackwood's abode, suggesting the operation of some delicate machinery, perhaps a laboratory apparatus. Then came the crucial observation. One morning, as Blackwood quietly opened his door to retrieve a delivered package, Holmes noted a small, almost cylindrical object in his hand, momentarily obscured by his sleeve. It was swiftly withdrawn, but the glimpse was enough. He frequently left and entered his apartment with either this small, innocuous-looking instrument or a similar package, its contents carefully concealed. "There, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice taut with suppressed excitement, "we have our man, or at least, the most likely candidate." A brilliant mind, skilled in the very subject matter of our professor's expertise, harboring a festering grievance, operating under the veil of academic solitude, and engaging in surreptitious activity right next door. The connection, I dare say, is becoming as clear as the noxious fumes that emanate from his laboratory. The pieces, though still disparate, were beginning to align. The meticulous, slow-acting nature of the poisoning, the choice of a biological agent, the subtle delivery mechanism, and now, the identification of a suspect with both the means and a palpable, if insidious, motive, the portrait of the malefactor was slowly, chillingly, emerging from the shadows. Chapter 6: The Unmasking of the Method. The suspicion surrounding Silas Blackwood solidified into conviction in Holmes's mind. Yet, conviction alone, however strong, was not proof. The methods of the poisoner, subtle and elusive as they were, required a demonstration equally subtle and unassailable. Holmes returned to Professor Finch's apartment, his mind already formulating a plan. "Watson," he began, addressing me with an air of conspiratorial urgency, "our theory of insidious delivery requires tangible corroboration. We know who we suspect, and we have a strong indication of what has been delivered, but the precise how remains somewhat conjectural." He knelt again at the threshold of Finch's bedroom, scrutinizing the minute gap beneath the door. "Our adversary is cunning, using a method that leaves minimal trace. But even the most meticulous hand leaves some impression." From his ubiquitous traveling bag, Holmes produced a small, flat tin, from which he carefully extracted a strip of paper, no wider than a man's finger, treated with a finely ground, almost invisible phosphorescent powder. With a delicate touch, he slid this strip just inside the bottom edge of Finch's door, ensuring it lay flat against the floorboards. This, my dear Watson, reacts with certain organic compounds. It is sensitive enough to register even the most minute disturbances, or the passage of a fine particulate. Next, he applied a microscopic film of a colorless, odorless chemical solution along the external base of the door frame, precisely where the faint residue had been observed. This reagent, when exposed to particular alkaloids or certain fungal derivatives, exhibits a distinct, if subtle, chromatic alteration. Our goal is to catch our elusive pest in the very act of contamination. The trap was set. The waiting was, as ever, the most arduous part. We spent the remainder of the day and a portion of the night in Finch's study, feigning an interest in his botanical texts, while our senses remained acutely tuned to any sound from the adjacent apartment. Holmes, with his ear pressed against the shared wall, detected the familiar low hum of Blackwood's equipment, occasionally interspersed with a soft clinking sound, as if glass instruments were being handled. Just after midnight, a faint, almost imperceptible whoosh sound reached us from the hallway, followed by a slight, almost inaudible scrape against the floorboards. Holmes's head snapped up. "That is our cue, Watson." He waited another 10 minutes, allowing time for any residue to settle, before cautiously approaching Finch's door. With his magnifying glass, he examined the phosphorescent strip. A barely discernible, almost ethereal glow emanated from several minuscule points along its surface, indicating the passage of fine particles. Then, he applied a chemical indicator to the clear film he had placed earlier. Almost instantly, a tiny patch of the film at the very bottom edge of the door frame, near the floor, shifted in color from transparent to a faint, yellowish-green hue. "There, Watson!" Holmes exclaimed, a triumphant glint in his eye. "Conclusive proof of both physical disturbance and chemical contamination. A finely dispersed aerosol, undoubtedly. The reaction suggests the presence of an alkaloid or a complex organic derivative. And the slight scraping sound, coupled with the glow on the strip, points to the precise instrument of delivery." He paced slowly, articulating his deductions. "Blackwood, I surmise, has devised a cunning contrivance. Not a mere hand pump, which would be too noisy, nor a simple spray, which would be too broad. No, he would require something precise, silent, and capable of projecting a fine mist or powder through the narrowest aperture." "A bellows, Holmes?" I ventured, thinking of the instruments used for blowing fine powders. "Too crude, perhaps. More likely a modified pipette or a small, hand-operated atomizer, fitted with a long, thin nozzle, possibly of copper or brass." He would push the nozzle discreetly under the door, activate the device with a barely audible squeeze or depress, and release the toxic mist into Finch's room. The slight scratch on the floorboards, which I noted earlier, would be caused by the repeated insertion and withdrawal of this very nozzle. My medical training now dovetailed perfectly with Holmes's scientific analysis. Given Professor Finch's background, and Blackwood's expertise in botany, the toxin is almost certainly derived from a natural source. Many plant alkaloids, particularly those found in certain nightshades or tropical species, exhibit precisely these slow-acting, neurotoxic effects. They can cause fatigue, muscle weakness, and respiratory depression, mimicking a slow, natural decline. Fungal toxins, too, contain compounds that could achieve such an effect, often difficult to identify in routine analyses. Indeed, Watson, Holmes affirmed. A poison designed to unravel the victim from within, to slowly extinguish his intellect and vitality, rather than to violently end his life. A revenge not of brute force, but of insidious scientific application. Our botanist has weaponized his knowledge, not for discovery, but for destruction. The cold, calculated brilliance of the crime sent a shiver down my spine. The unseen agent was no longer merely a hypothesis, its method of delivery had been unmasked, and its source, though yet to be confirmed by confession, was now an almost inescapable certainty. The stage was set for the final confrontation. Chapter 7: The Interrogation and Confession. The chill of the New York morning had scarcely begun to dissipate when Holmes and I made our way to apartment 4B. There was no need for subterfuge now, the game had reached its penultimate move. Holmes, his countenance grim and purposeful, rapped sharply on the door. After a moment, it was opened by Silas Blackwood himself. He stood framed in the doorway, a slight, almost cadaverous figure, his eyes blinking behind thick spectacles, betraying a flicker of surprise, perhaps even annoyance, at our unexpected presence. The faint, acrid scent of his laboratory, now unmistakably identified with the poison, wafted from within. "Mr. Silas Blackwood, I presume?" Holmes stated, his voice devoid of pleasantries, cutting through the thin morning air. "My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We are here regarding Professor Alastair Finch." Blackwood's pallid face tightened imperceptibly. "I am Blackwood. What concern is Professor Finch of yours?" "He is, as I understand, quite unwell." "I have little time for social calls, gentlemen, I am engaged in vital research." His tone was dismissive, attempting to project an air of academic absorption. "Indeed," Holmes replied, stepping forward with an unyielding determination that compelled Blackwood to retreat further into his apartment. I followed, closing the door behind us. The room was a chaotic jumble of books, scientific apparatus, and botanical specimens, reinforcing my earlier observations. A faint hum, which I now recognized as the sound of an air pump or a delicate distillation unit, resonated from a corner. Holmes wasted no time in preliminaries. He fixed Blackwood with an unwavering gaze. "Professor Finch's illness, Mr. Blackwood, is not, as you suggest, a natural malady. It is, in fact, a poisoning. And the perpetrator, I am quite certain, is yourself." Blackwood's face drained of what little color it possessed. "Preposterous! An outrageous accusation. I am a man of science, devoted to my research." "A man of science, indeed," Holmes conceded, his voice dangerously soft. "One who knows precisely how to leverage his knowledge for nefarious ends. Consider, if you will, the unique constellation of Professor Finch's symptoms, the chronic fatigue, the muscle weakness, the intermittent tremors, the respiratory distress, the profound mental lethargy. Symptoms, Dr. Watson will confirm, consistent with a slow-acting neurotoxin, perhaps an alkaloid derived from a certain rare fungus or a highly specialized plant extract. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. Blackwood swallowed hard, his gaze now fixed on Holmes's lips as if mesmerized. "Now, consider the manner of its delivery," Holmes continued, stepping closer. "Not through food or drink, which would be too crude for a mind such as yours. Not through direct contact, which would risk exposure. No, your method was far more insidious, Mr. Blackwood. Daily, precisely, and with a perverse consistency, you introduced this poison into Professor Finch's private chambers, through the narrow aperture beneath his door." Blackwood opened his mouth as if to protest, but no sound emerged. "We noted the subtle residue at the threshold, a faint, herbaceous odor that emanated from your own apartment, growing stronger when you opened your door. We observed your peculiar nocturnal habits, your comings and goings, always with a small, innocuous-looking implement carefully concealed. And last night, Mr. Blackwood, we set a small trap." Holmes produced the now glowing phosphorescent strip from his waistcoat pocket. "This, Mr. Blackwood, registered the minute particles you sent beneath Professor Finch's door. And this," he added, holding up the tiny, yellowish-green discoloration on the chemical film, "confirmed the presence of the very organic compound that has been slowly, systematically, eroding Professor Finch's life force." He then held up his hand, imitating the action of pushing a thin object under a door. "A specially modified atomizer, perhaps, or a silent bellows, with a fine, extended nozzle designed to project an aerosolized toxin. The faint scratch on the floorboards, incidentally, perfectly matches the width of such a device being repeatedly inserted and withdrawn." Blackwood stared at the evidence, his defiance crumbling. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. The meticulous, logical dismantling of his carefully constructed crime left him exposed, stripped of all pretense. His eyes, usually sharp, now swam with a desperate, cornered animal look. "Why, Mr. Blackwood?" Holmes pressed, his voice now colder, harder. What motive could drive a man of science to such prolonged and cruel depravity? The question, like a pinprick to a taut balloon, released a torrent of pent-up bitterness. Blackwood's composure finally shattered. He slumped into a chair, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and despair. "He overshadowed me," Blackwood hissed, his voice raspy. "Always Finch. His name on every paper, his theories lauded, his reputation unblemished. He dismissed my findings at the '98 symposium, a minor point perhaps to him, but a personal insult to my intellect. He called my work speculative and unfounded. He made me out to be a fool." He leaned forward, his eyes blazing with a corrosive envy. "I merely sought to diminish him. To watch his intellect, his vitality, his very being, slowly fade away. To see him become a shell, a shadow of the man they all admired. A fate far more poetic, far more fitting, than a swift and ignoble death. I wanted him to understand, as he lay dying, that my intellect, my understanding of natural science, was superior, precise enough to orchestrate his slow, agonizing demise." He then, with a twisted pride, confessed to the precise nature of his poison, a rare, highly specific neurotoxin extracted from the Filaria obtrusio, a species of fungus he had cultivated himself, its effects meticulously studied to mimic a cascade of chronic health conditions. He had administered it daily, a tiny, almost imperceptible puff, knowing it would be untraceable by conventional medical means, slowly but surely bringing about Professor Finch's decline. "I designed it," he whispered, a mad glint in his eye, "to be the perfect, untraceable revenge. To destroy him from within, a biological dissolution that would baffle all the experts." Holmes merely nodded, his expression unreadable. The confession, though shocking in its cruelty and scientific ingenuity, was precisely what he had expected. The cold, hard logic of detection had once again stripped away the layers of deception, revealing the dark core of human malevolence beneath. Silas Blackwood, the brilliant but envious scholar, was unmasked. Chapter 8: Restoration and Reflection. With Silas Blackwood's chilling confession ringing in our ears, the urgency of our mission shifted from detection to restoration. I immediately conveyed the precise nature of the toxin, the rare neurotoxin from Filaria obtrusio, to the bewildered New York physicians attending Professor Finch. Armed with this crucial information, they were able to initiate a targeted treatment, a course of specialized antitoxins and supportive care that I helped to oversee, drawing upon my own medical expertise and knowledge of obscure biological agents. The professor's recovery, though slow and arduous, commenced almost immediately, a testament to the precision of Blackwood's confession and the resilience of the human constitution. Within days, the cloud of lethargy began to lift, the tremor subsided, and a faint color returned to his pallid cheeks. "He will regain his faculties, Watson," I confidently assured Mrs. Hudson, who wept tears of relief by Finch's bedside. The damage, though significant, was not irreversible, thanks to the swift identification of the specific poison. Meanwhile, Silas Blackwood, still reeling from the sudden unraveling of his meticulously constructed scheme, was handed over to the New York authorities. A grim-faced Detective O'Connell, a burly Irishman with a no-nonsense demeanor, listened to Holmes's concise explanation of the case, his eyes widening progressively as the tale of scientific malice unfolded. "To think, Mr. Holmes," O'Connell rumbled, shaking his head, "such devilry right next door. We'd have been scratching our heads for months, blaming it on some jungle fever or a nervous breakdown. You've saved the professor's life and exposed a villain of the most cunning sort." Holmes merely inclined his head. The application of intellect, detective, can be as varied as human nature itself. In this instance, it was bent towards a most deplorable end. Blackwood, silent and sullen, offered no resistance, his intellectual vanity seemingly satisfied by the mere fact that his diabolical method had been fully comprehended by Holmes. Our work in New York now complete, Holmes found a rare moment for reflection. We stood on the deck of our returning steamer, the colossal silhouette of Manhattan receding into the morning mist, its monumental buildings dwarfed by the vast ocean. "A curious case, Watson," Holmes mused, tapping his pipe against the railing. "A testament, perhaps, to the enduring truth that human wickedness knows no geographical bounds, nor does it require the blunt instrument of physical violence." Here we saw envy, that most corrosive of human emotions, refined into a scientific weapon, wielded with a precision that bordered on artistry. "It was a testament, Holmes, to your unparalleled observation and deduction," I countered, scribbling a few final notes in my journal. Without your discernment, Finch would surely have perished, and the true nature of his demise would have remained forever obscured. "My dear Watson, you are too kind," he said, a rare, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. The crime itself was a fascinating study. A slow, methodical erasure, a dismantling of the intellect, rather than a sudden, dramatic end. The perpetrator sought not merely death, but degradation, a prolonged humiliation of his rival. A far more insidious form of revenge than a simple murder, demonstrating a profound psychological understanding of his victim. He took a final puff from his pipe, watching the smoke dissipate over the waves. It reminds one that while the settings may change, from the foggy lanes of London to the bustling avenues of New York, the fundamental springs of human action, both noble and depraved, remain constant. Greed, jealousy, vanity, revenge, these are the timeless architects of villainy, clothed anew in each era's scientific advancements. As the new world faded into the distant horizon, replaced by the boundless, grey expanse of the Atlantic, I felt the familiar satisfaction of a difficult case brought to a just conclusion. Professor Finch, once a fading friend, was on the path to recovery, his mind and body saved from a cruel fate. Silas Blackwood, the venomous scholar, would face the consequences of his scientific malice. And Holmes and I, with the quiet hum of the ship's engines beneath us, were returning to our familiar quarters at Baker Street, ready for whatever new mysteries the old world might present. The grand, audacious energy of New York, a city that pulsed with both promise and peril, was now but a vivid memory, another chapter in the chronicles of Sherlock Holmes.